Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. On a sun-baked Texas morning, Vineyard owner Matt Holland found an $18,000 fine in his mailbox from an HOA he didn't even belong to. What started as a laugh turned into a war of paper, politics, and grit against a president who thought no fence could keep her out. It was one of those warm Texas mornings where the air smells like sun-baked earth and hay, and you can hear the faint creak of the barn roof settling as the day heats up. I just finished feeding the horses, brushing down my favorite mare, and was heading toward the vineyard to check on the grapes. That's when I noticed the red flag sticking out of my old metal mailbox at the end of the drive. Usually all I get are supply catalogs, bills, or the occasional letter from a friend in Austin. This was different. The envelope was thick, stiff, and had a shiny embossed logo in the corner. 3 little pine trees over the words Clearwater Meadows Homeowners Association. I almost laughed right there by the gate. Clearwater Meadows was the neighboring gated community full of oversized stucco houses, manicured lawns, and people who panic if their hedges grow a quarter-inch past regulation height. My place isn't even inside their gates. 15 acres of pasture, a working barn, and a small winery I've been running for the last 5 years. We're separated by a county road and a barbed wire fence, both of which, last I checked, were still legal boundaries in the state of Texas. I carried the envelope back to the porch and tore it open while the coffee finished brewing. Inside was a formal letter on heavy cream paper, printed in a font that screamed corporate lawyer and smelled faintly of expensive toner. It began, "Notice of violation and fine." My eyes flicked down to the amount, $18,000. I actually had to reread it to make sure they hadn't added an extra zero for fun. The so-called violations? Visual pollution due to unapproved vineyard installation. Unpermitted barn visible from community roadway. And my personal favorite, noise disturbances caused by agricultural machinery. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the page, expecting Ashton Kutcher to jump out of the bushes and tell me I was on some forgotten episode of Punk'd. Instead, my phone buzzed with a weather alert, reminding me this was, unfortunately, real life. I grabbed my file box from the office, deed, property survey, tax records, all neatly organized from my years as a court officer. I know exactly where my land begins and ends, and nowhere in those papers is there a clause about answering to a pack of HOA busybodies. Still, I figured I'd give them the courtesy of a phone call before I started using their letter as a coaster. I dialed the number at the bottom of the page. After 2 rings, a crisp female voice answered, "Clearwater Meadows HOA. This is Karen Dalton, President. How may I help you?" "Matt Holland here," I said. "I just received a notice from your office about some supposed violations. I think you've got the wrong guy. My property's outside your HOA boundaries." There was a pause, then a tone like she was explaining algebra to a toddler. "Mr. Holland, our rules apply to the surrounding area as well. It's called maintaining community standards. Your structures and activities are visible from our community, which makes them subject to our bylaws. You'll need to remit payment in full within 30 days to avoid further action." I smiled to myself because I could practically hear the self-satisfaction dripping from her voice. "Ma'am, I've been a court officer for over a decade. I know exactly what your bylaws do and don't cover. My vineyard, my barn, my land. None of it belongs to Clearwater Meadows or its HOA. You can put that $18,000 back in whatever fantasy budget you're running." Her voice went cold. "If you refuse to comply, we'll have no choice but to escalate. That could include involving law enforcement. I strongly suggest you reconsider." "Then I guess I'll see you in court," I said, and hung up before she could puff herself up any further. I spent the rest of the morning making fresh copies of all my documents, property deed, county plat maps, even the letter from the state certifying my winery license. Each went into a neat folder marked HOA nonsense. If there's one thing my years in law enforcement taught me, it's that bullies like Karen don't back down just because you tell them to. They double down. And if she was willing to send me this letter, I had a feeling she wasn't done yet. That evening, after closing up the barn and checking the locks, I stood at the end of the driveway, looking toward the distant rooftops of Clearwater Meadows. The sun was setting behind them, turning their perfect white walls gold. Somewhere in there, Karen Dalton was probably sipping a glass of overpriced Chardonnay and congratulating herself on a job well done. I hoped she enjoyed it because this was going to be one hell of a ride. 2 mornings later, I was in the middle of tightening a gate hinge when I heard the low rumble of engines coming up my gravel drive. It wasn't delivery trucks. Too steady, too deliberate. I wiped my hands on a rag and stepped out toward the sound. 2 black and white county patrol cars rolled to a stop by the barn, dust swirling around them. Both doors opened. Out stepped 2 uniformed deputies, one older and broad-shouldered with a gray mustache, the other younger, still carrying that careful stiffness of someone who hasn't yet been yelled at enough times on the job. The older one gave me a nod, but the younger looked down at his notepad like he was reading a script. "Mr. Holland?" the younger asked. "That's me," I said. "We received a complaint from the Clearwater Meadows Homeowners Association," he began, "regarding unpaid dues, refusal to comply with HOA regulations, and interference with access to common property." I stared at him for a second, then gave a short laugh. "That's a new one. Hang on." I motioned toward my office in the winery building. "Let's get in the shade and I'll show you exactly what's what." Inside, I pulled the neatly prepared folder from the desk. "Here's my deed county survey and a letter from the tax assessor. You'll see my land isn't inside their gates, isn't part of their plat, and isn't subject to any HOA jurisdiction. I've got no dues, no agreement, and certainly no obligation to let them access anything." The older deputy flipped through the papers with a slow, practiced eye, nodding to himself. "Looks pretty cut and dry," he said finally. "This is a civil matter, not criminal. We've got no business telling you to pay a fine to a group you're not a member of." The younger deputy seemed almost relieved to close his notebook. "We'll note that for the record." That's when I heard a voice from outside, sharp enough to carry through the open window. "Officers, over here." I walked to the doorway, and there she was, Karen Dalton in all her glory, standing at my front gate in a pale blue pantsuit, sunglasses perched on her nose, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. Beside her stood 3 residents from Clearwater Meadows, each with their phones out, filming. "Has he admitted his violations?" she called, like this was a courtroom drama and she was delivering the big line. The older deputy's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, this is a private matter. You and your neighbors need to stay off his property unless invited." Karen strode a few steps closer, stopping just shy of the fence. "We're documenting evidence. His so-called vineyard is an eyesore visible from our main entrance, and he's operating a barn without clearance. He owes $18,000, and the board has authorized collection action." "Then collect in civil court," I said evenly. "And while you're at it, review the county plat map, page 3, bottom left corner. You'll find my property isn't colored in HOA green." Her lips thinned into a straight line. The deputies wrapped up quickly after that, leaving with copies of my documents. As they pulled away, Karen shouted after them, "This isn't over, Mr. Holland." The last part echoed across the pasture like a bad movie villain's line. By evening, I had the ladder out and was mounting a pair of motion-activated cameras at the gate. Another went on the barn, angled toward the driveway. Each one was hooked to a cloud backup and my phone. My years in law enforcement taught me 2 things: keep your paperwork in order and your eyes open. And something told me Karen was just getting warmed up. A week slid by without a peep from Clearwater Meadows, and I started to think maybe the public humiliation in front of 2 deputies had been enough to make Karen retreat. That was wishful thinking. She wasn't the type to lick her wounds quietly. She was the type to plot. I found out exactly how much plotting she'd done when 2 official-looking envelopes landed in my mailbox, each with a state seal in the corner. The first was from the Texas Department of Agriculture, the second from the Texas Alcoholic Beverage Commission. Both were notifications of scheduled compliance inspections in response to citizen complaints regarding unlicensed sales and unsanitary storage of agricultural products. I didn't need a handwriting analyst to know whose citizenship had birthed those complaints. I called both offices immediately, explained the situation, and told them they were welcome to come sooner rather than later. The Ag Department inspector, a wiry man named Salazar with sun-leathered skin, showed up the next morning in a state pickup. The TABC inspector, a younger woman named Chambers, arrived a few hours later. I walked them through the winery, from the grape presses to the climate-controlled storage room, where barrels sat in neat rows. Salazar peered at the stainless steel equipment and clean concrete floor. "I've seen operating rooms with more dust than this place," he muttered. Chambers checked my licenses, the federal and state permits, and the sales logs I keep in binders for each year. "You're about as compliant as it gets," she said. Frankly, I wish half the places I inspect were this organized. I offered them coffee before they left. Salazar took his black Chambers past, and both left with signed inspection forms stating no violations observed. I slipped those into my HOA nonsense folder and felt the tension in my shoulders ease just a notch, but the relief didn't last. That evening, a friend of mine who runs the local feed store told me he'd overheard Karen in the parking lot talking to another Clearwater Meadows resident. According to him, she was just getting started and had a few more levers to pull. That was enough to make me rethink my passive stance. The next day, I drove into town to see an old contact, Frank Torres, a former county investigator who now works in the prosecutor's office. Frank and I went back years. I'd testified in more than a few cases he'd built. I laid out the whole mess on his desk. The bogus fine, the police visit, the inspections. Frank leaned back, chewing on the cap of his pen. "You know, we've had whispers about Clearwater Meadows HOA for a while," he said. "Overcharging residents, phantom repairs, contracts going to relatives. No one's brought us anything solid." That was the opening I needed. I told him I'd start digging. I wasn't talking about creeping around in the dark. I meant talking to people, finding paper trails, using the same persistence that used to get me confessions from stubborn defendants. Over the next few days, I made casual visits to 2 residents I knew by acquaintance, folks who'd bought in early and weren't exactly thrilled with how things were run now. I didn't press them hard, I just asked about HOA life these days. One man, an older Navy vet, grumbled that his annual dues had doubled in 3 years, and when he had asked for an expense breakdown, Karen had told him to come to the meeting, and then refused to answer questions. Another resident hinted at mysterious maintenance projects billed to the community that no one had ever seen crews working on. The more I heard, the more I knew Karen's little war with me might just be a small part of a much bigger game she was running. If she was bold enough to go after someone outside her HOA, she probably felt untouchable inside it. That kind of arrogance leaves footprints. Back home, I started scanning county records for contracts tied to Clearwater Meadows. In less than 2 hours, I found 3 awarded to a landscaping company registered to an address that matched Karen's maiden name on the property deed records. Same last name as the owner? Either a hell of a coincidence or the tip of a very fat iceberg. By the end of the week, I had a list of potential leads and a clear shift in my mindset. I wasn't just defending my vineyard anymore, I was going hunting. By Monday morning, my casual poking around had turned into something closer to a full-time investigation. I wasn't wearing a badge anymore, but old habits have a way of sticking. The HOA nonsense folder had grown into a small stack of binders, each labeled with a different angle: contracts, resident complaints, financial records, and the newest one, personal links. That last one was already my favorite. Through the county's online records portal, I dug deeper into Clearwater Meadows' public filings. What I found made me whistle low under my breath. At least half a dozen contracts over the past 3 years had gone to companies with suspiciously close ties to either Karen Dalton or 2 other board members. One fencing contract worth $78,000 had been awarded to a Dalton Property Services, registered to a P.O. box that matched Karen's business license for an old, supposedly defunct cleaning service. I decided to confirm I wasn't just seeing patterns where there weren't any. For that, I needed eyes and ears inside the community. Luck handed me exactly that. Late that afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. On the other end was a man who introduced himself only as Bill, a longtime resident of Clearwater Meadows. His voice was low, like he was calling from inside a confessional booth. "I heard you've been asking questions," he said, "and I heard what she's been doing to you. You're not the first." That got my attention. Bill claimed he'd been fined repeatedly for infractions that didn't exist. Everything from phantom trash cans left on the curb to unapproved solar panels that had been on his roof for over a decade. He was fed up, but every time he tried to rally neighbors to push back, Karen would threaten legal action or tack on another fine. We met the next day in the corner booth of a diner just outside town. Bill was in his 60s, wiry with a trucker's cap pulled low and a manila envelope tucked under one arm. Over coffee, he slid the envelope across to me. Inside were photocopies of meeting minutes from HOA board sessions, several stamped confidential. In them, Karen openly discussed optimizing revenue through enforcement, and there were handwritten notes in the margins about targeting. Non-compliant outliers. One of those outliers was underlined. F's. Holland. Visible barn. Negative aesthetic impact. Bill also had a printed chain of emails between Karen and a contractor in which they joked about padding the invoice because the residents never check the books. It was exactly the kind of thing Frank at the prosecutor's office could sink his teeth into. When I got back to the farm, I spread everything out on my desk and started organizing it chronologically. The pattern was clear. Karen's board would identify a target, pile on fines until the person either paid or moved, then use the HOA funds, boosted by those fines, to pay inflated invoices to friendly contractors. In some cases, the work was never done at all. The next step was making it official. I called my attorney, Lisa Harding, and laid out what I had. Lisa didn't waste time. "We're sending her a cease and desist first thing tomorrow," she said. "And I want a full copy of every piece of evidence for the file. If she so much as breathes in your direction after that, we'll add harassment and attempted extortion to the list." True to her word, the letter went out by certified mail the next morning, a neatly packaged warning with legal teeth. I imagined Karen's face as she signed for it, probably somewhere between confused rage and the smug belief that she was still in control. Meanwhile, I hand-delivered a condensed packet of the juiciest evidence to Frank at the prosecutor's office. He didn't even try to hide his grin as he flipped through it. "This," he said, tapping the emails, "is gold. We'll open a preliminary investigation and see where it goes. You keep feeding me anything new." That night, as the sun dipped low and painted the vineyard in amber light, I added a new camera to the far fence line and replaced the batteries in the ones by the gate. I had a feeling Karen wouldn't go quiet just because a letter told her to. People like her didn't believe in boundaries, at least not ones that applied to them. And if I'd learned anything, it was that when you corner someone like that, they either back down or they get dangerous. 3 days after the cease and desist went out, the farm was unusually still. The kind of stillness where even the cicadas seemed to take the afternoon off. I was bottling a small batch of last year's Cabernet in the winery building when my phone buzzed with a text from one of my cameras at the front gate. Motion detected. I wiped my hands, opened the app, and there she was, Karen Dalton herself, parked just beyond the fence line in a shiny white SUV. She wasn't alone. 2 other women sat in the passenger seats, both of them HOA regulars I'd seen on her little entourage during the police visit. They didn't come through the gate, but Karen stepped out, holding up her phone and recording slow pans of my property like she was filming a documentary on rural blight. She lingered on the barn, the vineyard rows, even my truck. I watched her circle back toward the SUV, point at something on her phone, and laugh. She stayed there for maybe 5 minutes before leaving. The footage went straight into my evidence folder. That same evening, Frank from the prosecutor's office called. "We've got enough for a judge to approve a document hold," he said. "We'll need more to get a search warrant, but we're getting close. Keep your eyes open." I didn't have to wait long. The next morning, I found a new letter taped to my gate in a plastic sleeve. It was on Clearwater Meadows letterhead, board directive scrawled in bold at the top, and it accused me of ongoing safety hazards due to unsecured agricultural machinery within sight of the public. At the bottom, in neat cursive, was Karen's signature. No postage, no envelope, meaning she'd come onto my property to put it there. I called Lisa, my attorney, and read it to her verbatim. "Perfect," she said. "She just handed us harassment on a silver platter. Keep the letter, don't respond directly, and I'll file an addendum to our complaint." Meanwhile, the ripples inside Clearwater Meadows were starting to break the surface. Bill called again, this time with a trace of excitement in his voice. "Word is, a couple of board members aren't happy with Karen dragging the whole HOA into a fight with you. One of them, named Simmons, wants to talk. Says he's got proof of forged meeting minutes. We met after dark in the parking lot of a closed garden center just off the highway. Simmons was in his 40s, nervous but determined, and carried a laptop bag like it was full of live explosives. Inside were scans of HOA documents, including board meeting minutes that had clearly been altered. Dates changed, attendance lists doctored, and votes fabricated to approve large spending projects. In several cases, the signatures of absent members had been lifted from other documents and pasted in. Simmons admitted he'd gone along with it at first, figuring it was harmless, until he realized Karen was using the same tactics to bulldoze residents who couldn't fight back. "I've had enough," he said. "If she's stealing from us, she's stealing from my neighbors, and I'm not going to jail for her." Back at the farm, I spent hours cross-referencing his files with what Bill had given me earlier. The overlap was damning. Same contractors, same inflated invoices, same pattern of targeting individuals before a big project got rubber-stamped. By the weekend, Lisa had updated our filings again, and Frank was preparing a formal request for a search warrant. The pressure was working, but I knew Karen wouldn't go down quietly. Sure enough, on Sunday afternoon, another camera alert came through, this time from the Vineyard side. I pulled it up to see two teenage boys I didn't recognize trying to squeeze through a gap in the fence. One carried a can of spray paint. I was halfway to the truck when they spotted the camera, froze, and bolted. I called the sheriff's office to report the trespass, and an hour later, a deputy tracked them down at a gas station. Turns out they were the sons of one of Karen's closest allies on the board. They claim they were just messing around, but given the timing, it didn't smell like coincidence. I added that incident to the growing pile of evidence. Karen had moved from paper harassment to attempted vandalism by proxy. She was running out of chess moves, and that's when people tend to flip the board entirely. I just had to be ready when she tried. By the time the first week of October rolled in, the air had that dry, metallic edge that meant fall was settling over the county. I was up early repairing a section of fence along the south pasture when my phone lit up with a call from Frank at the prosecutor's office. His tone was clipped but energized. "We got it," he said. "Judge signed the warrant for the HOA office. We're moving in 2 days. Keep this under your hat. We don't want Dalton catching wind before we're on her doorstep." I agreed, but I couldn't help wondering how she'd react when the knock on the door wasn't from some resident with a complaint, but from plain clothes. Investigators ready to haul her files into evidence bags. That afternoon, Bill called with another update from inside Clearwater Meadows. Karen was holding a special session of the board, and the rumor was she was planning a big public strike against me before whatever she thought I had could gain traction. According to him, she'd been making noise about calling the sheriff again over imminent safety concerns and non-compliance with public nuisance ordinances. The session was tomorrow. I didn't need a crystal ball to see where this was going. She was going to stage a scene, probably with a few of her diehards in tow, and try to get me hauled off in handcuffs while her people filmed the whole thing. The thought almost made me laugh, right up until I remembered how unpredictable she'd been getting lately. The next morning, I prepped for whatever circus was coming. I made sure all my cameras were online, fresh batteries in the backups, multiple angles covering the driveway, barn, vineyard, and gates. I even called the sheriff's office preemptively and asked to speak to the duty sergeant. When I explained what was likely about to happen, he assured me any call from Clearwater Meadows about me would get flagged for supervisory review before a deputy was dispatched. Sure enough, just after lunch, one of the front gate cameras pinged me. There was Karen striding up the drive in a coral blazer, flanked by 3 board members, all looking like they were headed to a groundbreaking ceremony. One carried a manila folder, another had what looked like a folded easel. I stepped out onto the porch as they stopped just outside the property line. Karen cupped her hands and called out, "Mr. Holland, the board has unanimously voted to order the removal of your unsafe structures. You are in violation of county code, and we are here to serve notice." I held up my phone so she could see I was recording. "Step 1 foot past that gate, and you're trespassing. Step 2 feet, and you'll be explaining it to the deputies. Again." She smiled like I'd just told a charming joke. "We're within our rights. This is for the good of the community." Before I could answer, a dark SUV rolled up behind them. 4 people got out, 2 men, 2 women, plain clothes, but with badges hanging from their belts. Frank was one of them. Karen's expression faltered. "And who are you?" she demanded. Frank flipped open a leather folder. "County Prosecutor's Office. We have a warrant to search the Clearwater Meadows HOA offices for evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. You'll need to come with us." The folder in her board member's hand slipped to the ground. The guy with the easel just stood there, looking like he wished the asphalt would swallow him. Karen tried to recover, spouting something about misunderstandings and political vendettas, but Frank wasn't listening. "Ms. Dalton, you can walk to the car, or you can be escorted. Your choice." By the time they loaded her into the SUV, the rest of the board had scattered like quail. I watched them go, the cameras catching every angle. The circus had come, all right, only the clown car was headed somewhere else entirely. The day after Karen's very public ride in the county SUV, the local gossip machine was in overdrive. You couldn't walk into the feed store, diner, or even the post office without overhearing someone dissecting the scene at my gate. People were asking if I'd finally broken the HOA's back, or if she'd somehow talk her way out of it. I didn't answer those questions. I didn't have to. By noon, Frank called with an update. "The warrant pulled more than we expected," he said. "We've got hard copies of falsified meeting minutes, bank records showing payments to her family's businesses, and emails instructing contractors to inflate invoices. It's not just misconduct, it's criminal." He also told me 2 of the board members were now fully cooperating, turning over personal devices and adding sworn statements to the file. The investigation had shifted from preliminary to active prosecution. Charges were being drafted. That afternoon, a different kind of visitor showed up at my gate. It was Simmons, the board member who'd slipped me the forged documents weeks earlier. He looked more relaxed now, less like a man carrying contraband. "I wanted to say thanks," he said, "for not letting her steamroll you. People in there, they've been scared for years. You gave them a reason to speak up." I nodded, but I knew Karen wasn't finished until she was wearing county-issued khakis. Sure enough, 2 days later, one of my cameras pinged again. This time, it wasn't Karen. It was a process server in a cheap suit, holding a manila envelope. I met him at the gate. "Summons," he said, handing it over. "Filed by Clearwater Meadows HOA, claiming damages from your alleged interference with community governance." It was laughable. The HOA was hemorrhaging leadership, bank accounts frozen under court order, and they were still trying to hit me with a civil suit. I signed for it, called Lisa, and by that evening she'd drafted a counterclaim citing harassment, defamation, and malicious prosecution. She was practically giddy. "They just handed us a second courtroom to beat them in," she said. Meanwhile, the prosecutor's office moved fast. Within a week, formal charges were announced against Karen and 2 board members: fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and criminal conspiracy. The sheriff's office executed arrest warrants, this time at the HOA office itself. Karen was led out in handcuffs, hair pulled back, no sunglasses, no coral blazer, just a sour expression and a gray sweater. The news crew from Channel 8 was parked right outside, cameras rolling as she was placed in the back of a patrol car. I watched the footage that evening from my kitchen table, the glow of the TV reflecting off the polished wood. It wasn't satisfaction I felt. Not exactly. It was more like the steady exhale you take after holding your breath for months. I knew the court process would take time, but the tide had finally turned. 2 days later, I drove into town for feed and couldn't make it through the store without 3 people stopping me to say they'd heard the HOA might be dissolved entirely. Bill called to confirm it. A petition had been circulating inside Clearwater Meadows, and more than 60% of the residents had already signed in favor of liquidation. Without Karen's grip and with the board imploding, they wanted out of the whole system. Standing there by the grain sacks, phone to my ear, I realized something. This had started as a fight to keep one HOA from reaching across a county road into my life. Now it was about dismantling a machine that had been bleeding its own members for years. And it was almost over. Court day for Karen came with the kind of restless humidity that made your shirt stick to your back before noon. I didn't plan to attend, but Frank asked if I could be there. For the record, he said, and maybe also because he knew the sight of me sitting quietly in the gallery would gnaw at her. The county courthouse was buzzing. Reporters clustered by the steps, their cameras set on tripods, waiting for the defendant's arrival. When Karen finally appeared, escorted by her attorney, the flashbulbs went off like a lightning storm. Gone was the confident HOA president in tailored blazers. She wore a plain navy suit, hair pulled tight, lips pressed into a line that looked carved from stone. She didn't glance my way as she passed, though I saw the muscle twitch in her jaw when she realized I was already seated inside. The proceedings moved faster than I expected. The state had built a tight case. Forged signatures on HOA meeting minutes, bank transfers to shell companies linked to her relatives, falsified invoices for landscaping projects that never happened. Frank walked the jury through it like he was guiding a tour bus. Efficient, no wasted motion. When Simmons took the stand, you could have heard a pin drop. He detailed how votes were fabricated, how dissenters were threatened with fines, and how Karen orchestrated it all under the guise of community improvement. Each time he named her directly, she sat a little straighter, but her lawyer kept a hand on her arm, probably to keep her from snapping. By the third day, the defense's strategy was clear. Claim it was all a misunderstanding, that bookkeeping errors were to blame, and that personal vendettas, mine in particular, had poisoned the HOA against her. Lisa, who joined Frank's team as a cooperating counsel, shredded that angle on cross-examination. "You're asking the court to believe," she said, "that tens of thousands of dollars walked out of HOA accounts and into your family's companies without you noticing?" Karen's answer was a stiff, "I don't recall." The jury did recall. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they returned guilty verdicts on all major counts: fraud, embezzlement, forgery, and conspiracy. The sentencing hearing came 2 weeks later. I sat through that one too. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a voice like gravel, laid it out plainly. 12 years in state prison, restitution in the low 7 figures, and a permanent bar from holding any position in a homeowners association in Texas. Karen didn't cry. She didn't shout. She just stared straight ahead as the bailiff led her away, the sound of her heels on the courtroom floor echoing like a slow metronome. The fallout in Clearwater Meadows was immediate. The residents voted by an overwhelming margin to dissolve the HOA. The petition went through county channels in record time, and within a month, the association was legally defunct. Its remaining funds, what little was left after restitution orders, were split proportionally among homeowners. I got a call from one of the new community organizers asking if I'd be interested in consulting on setting up a voluntary neighborhood watch, just to keep things friendly. I wished them luck, but declined. I'd had my fill of HOA politics for several lifetimes. A few weeks later, the county held a small ceremony to recognize people who'd helped root out local corruption. I didn't think much of it, but when my name was called, I walked up to the podium and accepted a framed letter of thanks from the commissioner. It wasn't about the paper. It was about the quiet acknowledgement that sometimes standing your ground mattered, not just for yourself, but for everyone stuck under the same thumb. Back at the farm, life settled into its old rhythm. The vines needed tending, the horses needed feeding, and the wine practically made itself if you were patient. At the front gate, just beneath the private property sign, I hung a new metal plaque. It read, "No trespassing, not HOA property." A few days later, Bill stopped by with a bottle of his own homemade whiskey. We sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the tree line. "You know," he said, "when this all started, I figured you'd just pay the fine to make it go away. Never thought you'd take down the whole damn HOA." I shrugged. I didn't either, but once you let people push you off your land, they don't stop. They just push further. We clinked glasses. The cicadas had come back, buzzing in the warm night air, and for the first time in months, the only sound from the road was the occasional pickup truck heading home. No SUVs idling at the gate. No cameras in my face. No HOA president with a clipboard declaring war. Just the quiet hum of a farm that finally belonged, undisputed, to the man who worked it.